We just talked a little bit about the future of decentralization from a technical perspective, and actually turned out to be quite philosophical and an ethics issue as well. But here, we're really kind of looking at this from the governance, oversight, and legal framework. And just kind of a note before we begin, when we first started out building this community and this group of COALA and blockchain workshops, it was, we were lucky enough to be knowledgeable about the technology and also lawyers, so we could see how there was this weird confluence and intersection. And actually, we benefited from your scholarship and from all of the pioneers from the early days on all the horrific things we had seen with the internet, but the potential and really what happened in practice. So I think we were just lucky enough to be clued in to see this coming. And what happened was, as we tried to figure out what the legal implications of these technologies would be, we realized we needed the technologists to explain to the lawyers exactly how it worked. And we needed the lawyers to explain the technology exactly how the legal architecture worked, so that we could really come together. So that was actually built into the first blockchain workshops. So we're really happy that was the right choice. I think in your slides, there were these 4 modalities and the interplay of these modalities. And right now, with technological change, the interplay and the complexity of the interplay and the push and pull between the 4 modalities are just accelerating at such pace. And actually, there's a lot of hidden strings behind all of this as well. I mean, you saw this in the Bitcoin space early on. The narrative around what Bitcoin was in the news was driving the policy around the regulation around Bitcoin. And actually, the first impression I think that a lot of people got of the network was that it was so anonymous, it would enable all of these crazy things. And actually, the real story, what was really frustrating for us behind the scenes was that the real story was that this is so radically transparent that it can be a tool of total surveillance. So you were seeing this mismatch, and you were seeing the markets respond to this narrative in the news, riffing off of the worst and most sensationalized uses of blockchain, and it was creating this whole mess. And so, how do you see decentralizations and blockchains? And I'd like to hear from all of you guys in the evolutionary pressures of these modalities. Will it force will it create norms, decentralized norms that allow new norms to emerge that can be levers against things like regulatory capture? Will regulatory capture reemerge and try to take a piece of the pie with decentralization? Will you see things like backdoors and closed internets and things like that? How do you see decentralization and blockchains as affecting this interplay of the things that constrain or enable our behavior?
Well, I mean, one hopeful fact about decentralization in a platform that's global is that makes regulatory capture harder because there's more regulators. So there's not a central, like it's not just Washington, it's now, okay. But the other part about it, and this is to respond to, I thought your really compelling analogy, and as a law professor, I like analogies, so I'm on your side with the analogy, but when you were talking about the landlord and changing the locks, I mean, what that analogy was trading on was the intuition that in some sense everybody had access to the means to do something about the problem. But of course, what this platform is creating is a world where people can be in Nigeria, and people can be in Switzerland, and people can be in the United States, and if things break down, there's no obvious way in which we can invoke anything to go and to clean up the mess, right? So part of what the issue gets raised here is how do we begin to deal with a platform that is way far ahead of the social governance infrastructure for dealing with the problems the platform might be creating?
It's an interesting question, and I think also, once again, one that's probably not exclusive to this particular industry, which, it's this sort of general issue of, well, what happens when, technology in general is moving forward so quickly that the legal system hasn't quite yet caught up. And as for, as far as answering that, I guess the base case is to just do nothing and let whatever good and whatever bad both come. And what you can do on top of that is, either I suppose come up with ways to make the regulatory side more efficient, but then that comes with its downsides as well, and counteracts parts of what sort of seem to be the point here. But you could also try to see, are there other approaches, possibly involving social norms, possibly some new kind of governance that could address some of these issues better?
So in my view, I'm obviously building upon all the work that Lawrence Lessig has done, but if we look at the four forces, I think there is it's basically whatever the internet has done on those four forces, which is increase the role of architecture on the regulation of individual and then forcing the law to attack or to control the other forces in order to indirectly regulate the individual. It's kind of exacerbated on the blockchain because the code becomes more and more able to regulate the behavior to a point that it's actually much more efficient to rely on code than to rely on the law. The transnationality is actually quite the same. And so how should the law react to that? Then we need to look at what are those different forces that we can use in order to eventually regulate the individual. So whether it is the market, and in this case, it's basically regulating the operator. So that's kind of what the Bit license done. So creating situation in which if you want to be, for instance, a Bitcoin operator, you need to comply with certain level of formalities. And indeed, in the end, what it does is that it becomes really difficult for all the small startups to operate in the space. And then you have this kind of re-centralization of the ecosystem where only big operator can actually operate with the Bitcoin market. And so it becomes easier, again, for the law to actually regulate individual by regulating the operators. Or you can regulate something, you can look at what the technology and regulate the developer or the people that are actually producing this technology. But I think there is one really new thing that the blockchain space is actually creating, which is even though the four forces still exist, it seems to me that there is this new issue that is being raised, which is the little red pathetic dot actually either is completely multiplied in lots of small dots, or actually at some point it can disappear, because when we enter into the smart contract, and we have those autonomous software which are not actually owned by anyone, they are just decentralized on the blockchain, then what are those four forces? What is the object of regulation of those four forces? What are we actually regulating? We're regulating software. And as long as we can identify who is the closest available person to that software, then we can actually impute responsibility and regulate that person. But in the point in which we actually close or cut the link between that, then I think it just disrupts completely the way in which the legal system is used to operate.
And one of the issues here, of course, is that cypherpunks fought quite a hard and unfortunately successful battle that basically declared that code is free speech in a lot of jurisdictions about 15 years ago. And one of the things that we're seeing here is basically this sort of extreme blurring of lines between, what exactly is speech, what exactly is money, what exactly is doing something. And in some levels, once some of these systems get powerful enough, that kind of hard distinction almost seems sort of harder to, I guess, justify logically, and that's something that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, but part of the history that I was trying to evoke, and maybe this is not, maybe we're not dealing with common knowledge, I thought we kind of were, was, there was that huge argument in the 90s and beginning before 9/11 in the United States about can the government regulate encryption and when I published my book, all these people writing about these technology companies will never give in to the government. They will never do what the government wants them to do because they will be defending the freedom of their users and blah, blah, blah. And then 9/11 happens, and what we know now is basically, guys in trench coats went to big technology companies and they said to those big technology companies, here's what you're going to do. And if you don't do this, we're not going to buy any of your machines anymore. And we're going to, find other ways to put pressure on you. And what did those technology companies do? They said, yes, sir, we'll jump. Just tell us how high to jump. I mean, they didn't defend the rights of, free speech or the right. I mean, there was pushback by certain people in those companies. And when this story is eventually told, it's going to be a really interesting, dramatic story of like people trying to do good in the context of, but the reality was the pressure and the conformity to that pressure was the most important issue. All these issues about whether free speech was involved just became completely irrelevant.
And what's really cool about this architecture, which I think Primavera just alluded to, is that you can suddenly have services without providers. You can have autonomous programs without, perhaps running autonomously based on some sort of set of principles. But I think that on one hand, I think we're very early in the beginning of norms around decentralization. So it's astonishing to me, just given our background and how with young people today, of which I think I am one as well, people seem to think privacy is dead. And to me, it's just insane that I have to explain why it's important that we retain our autonomy in this visible world. And so, that's a shifting norm. And so I think our responsibility and our ability to come together and try to influence good norms, I think is huge here. And then, as we have more of these self-executing programs, I have a couple questions. One is, every design involves trade-offs, and what constitutes the most optimal design depends on what values you have in those trade-offs. So I'd love to hear a little bit about those what kind of values we must recognize and what conflicts we must avoid. And then also in the creation of norms, what can we do, what concretely can we do to influence the emergence of new kinds of norms, not only just around behavior, but around laws and what we expect from governments and service providers and from each other.
Well, I think part of it, I believe in process more than I know what the particular answer is going to be. And part of it is recognizing how valuable it is to create conflicting positions inside of particular organizations. So, people always mocked the Google "do no harm" slogan. But what having that slogan on the wall meant inside of Google was that an engineer could sit in a meeting in Google and they would be talking about what they're going to do, and they could just point to that sign, and the sign said, "Do no evil." And they say, "Look what we're doing, this is evil." And it might not ultimately have an effect, but it changes the dynamic of that conversation inside of the company compared to another company where that sign doesn't exist. And the company director says, "Here's what you're going to do." And the only thing the engineer can say is, "I don't like that." "I don't like that" is not the same as "this is evil," and this sign says "do no evil." So I think the part of the last panel that was so informative was like thinking about what is the way in which we bring about the right conversation. I think the way to bring about the right conversation is to encourage the diversity and the conflict. And that's, in some sense, the great value of, the thing I love, so great value of engineers inside of this conversation is that they, they're not trained to conform to authority in the same way that like lawyers are trained, inside of the practice. And so this diversity of people is really an important part of getting the right answer. One of the most important insights that came from the study of the way organizations work is, really diversity, not for political correctness reasons, but really because of efficiency reasons. Diversity, people with different backgrounds, different, male, female, old, young, urban, rural. This diversity produces a conversation that yields the right answer, the best answer, more effectively than the top students from MIT, all sitting in the same room would do it. And so it's designing the context of the conversation that becomes the most important part to getting to the right answer.
And I will add to that also that so the Google motto is "don't do evil," and then there is for instance, the Blockstream company the motto is cannot do evil, right? Because they actually encode into their own, like, so it's a blockchain-based company, obviously. The idea is like, let's design things, let's design structure that actually, it's no longer a question whether or not we want to be evil, but we just constrain ourselves to technological due process, or however we want to call it, so that this is actually the act of encoding the non-evilness into the technology. So if we want to design a technology that we want to make sure that no one will ever be able to co-opt or take control in one way, then this is how it has to be designed. And so in this way, I think it's also important, in spite of talking about all the regulatory challenge that it actually calls, I think the blockchain also should be looked in a positive way in terms of what kind of new principle it's actually creating, and whether we can, like, whether the law, the regulatory landscape can actually try and absorb some of those principles in terms of, for instance, transparency and accountability. And so by using, like, on the one hand, the regulatory world needs to identify how it is possible to regulate this technology. On the other hand, I think it should also try and understand what it can take and how it can use this technology in order perhaps to optimize the way in which it operates, and to actually design or incorporate those principles into the technology in order to serve its own purpose.
Yeah, as far as sort of the culture around decentralization, I think that's also a particularly important point, because it does offer, like, this technology does offer the possibility of creating systems that do sort of very substantially change even the relationship between individuals and the service providers that they interact with. And so when you can have things like, just to give a trivial example, gambling sites where you can mathematically prove that every single coin that gets sent in is going to get sent out, then, how do we actually create the sort of surrounding infrastructure, the expectations, the norms that ensure that is what people expect, and people aren't willing to settle for anything less.
And do you think that this technology can enable both the efficiencies and the automation, the trustlessness, and what that offers in terms of kind of global inclusion, and also at the same time be flexible and just and merciful?
Can we have it all?
Can we? Can we?
Well, I actually will say that, of course, not now, and probably we don't know about the future, but at least we can try and get as much as we can. And I think the danger is, again, that because currently this technology can be used for good and bad, and because it depends on which perspective you put yourself, what is good and what is bad, there is always the possibility that you can see something, and, like, for instance, Tor, which is designed to be like really resilient against oppressive regime and supporting activists. On the other hand, this particular characteristic will indeed also be problematic, because then it can also be used by criminals, right? And so it seems to me that perhaps there is also, like, the blockchain is this new technology, and perhaps is providing a new way to actually promote certain values without necessarily going into the negative. But at the moment, we don't know yet. And I will say that the danger is that the regulation does not even let the time for this technology to explore all the possibility, because indeed you can, as soon as the government will identify that this technology might disrupt its sovereignty, then there is an incentive, obviously, to identify what is the one thing that they can use in order to create regulation that will then block and annihilate the opportunities of the technology. So in some extent, it's so we have this within the COALA team. We have these theories about the law of the horse and the law of the cyberspace. That the blockchain is kind of at the same time, it's like kind of the law of the platypus. In the sense that we don't really know what it is. It just looks like so many things at the same time, and it is being regulated with all those different regulatory bodies of law, because it looks a little bit like a security, because it looks a little bit like a currency, and maybe it's also a commodities. And so in some way, it's really difficult actually for any operators to do anything, because you're being constrained on every side. And so there is kind of this need to realize that actually this is a platypus and this is something new that we don't know. And we need to design or understand how to regulate it properly so as to enable this technology to actually fulfill its potential. And of course, by scrutinizing and controlling that it doesn't also go too much in the wrong way.
But we have to recognize inertia. Joey, I really liked Joey's intervention this morning when he was talking about the lawyer in Japan who said that setting up the internet service provider violated Japanese law. And his point was probably technically that was true. But there's some point at which the inertia, the power of just this developing technology overrides all of these legal regulations, despite their being technically in violation. And when I look at listen to like a lot of these conversations of the anti-money laundering regulations, and there's going to be a certain point at which this infrastructure and what's flowing through it is so big and powerful that it's the law that bends to the infrastructure rather than the infrastructure that's bending to the law. And in some ways that might be a good thing, in some ways it might be a bad thing, but there's just a certain reality of the momentum that is not going to be stoppable, and regulators need to kind of look to that place and think about what's the right rule given the expected momentum, rather than sort of imagining you're going to sit there as a lawyer and say there will be no internet in Japan because it violates Japanese law.
So I think the sort of points that we're driving at here is that just as the choices that we have as protocol developers are sort of fairly sort of low dimensional and abstract and constrained in some senses, the kinds of choices that governments have are probably going to end up sort of being similarly a bit further removed from the actual effects that they're trying to generate as well.
So actually, we're running out of time here, so we're just going to wrap this up now, if you don't mind. But I think to your point, it takes a lot of a diversity of views. It takes a lot of people involved to build these different bricks, so that we get to the right answer or something closer to the right answer. So I highly encourage all of you guys who are living your lives and having influence in your own spheres, and take this knowledge, talk about it, investigate it, look at it, come talk to us, and help build an inertia and a gravity towards something that we all believe in and we can live with. So thank you for everyone.